The leaves fell, but no one counted. They drifted quietly from the trees, one by one, in spirals and glides, carried not by windstorms or sudden gusts, but by the soft inevitability of time. Each descent was silent, weightless, and strangely dignified an event that deserved attention, perhaps, but received none. They detached not with drama, but with a subtle readiness, as if they had always known their moment would come and had no interest in resisting. Some tumbled lazily through the air and landed upon the grass with no fanfare. Others caught on branches, fences, or window sills, lingering a while before joining the rest below. Their colors, once vibrant, had dulled with grace, russet, gold, ochre, soft brown. But there was no parade of seasons this year. No one stood beneath the trees with a camera. No one gasped at the sudden brilliance of the canopy. The leaves fell, and the trees let them go, and the earth received them, and none of them required a witness. Perhaps once there had been someone who watched the leaves each year, someone who made note of the earliest red patch on the highest branch, someone who walked the long looping paths, just to feel the crisp whisper of leaves beneath their feet. Perhaps once there had been piles raked and kicked and photographed, but that time had passed, or moved elsewhere, or simply dissolved. Now the tree stood over an empty path. The bench beneath them was still solid, though the paint had chipped and the armrests wore the gentle polish of old hands long gone. No one sat there now. No one remarked how early or late the season seemed this year. No one pointed and said, "Look how many have fallen already." The ground was covered in a quilt of natural shedding, layered in rustling softness, but the world had gone quiet in its appreciation. It wasn't sadness that filled the air. Not quite. It was more like a deep stillness, a kind of breathless hush that settled over everything as if the space itself were pausing, waiting, but not for anything in particular. The sky had begun to carry the look of late afternoon, even in the morning, wide, pale, tired, and the sun, though it still climbed, no longer offered heat with confidence. Its light came slantwise, golden and kind, like a hand resting briefly on a shoulder without a word. The days had grown cooler, yes, but not harshly so. It was the kind of weather that reminded you to wear a sweater, but wouldn't he punish you if you forgot? The wind didn't howl, it murmured. It stirred the leaves in small eddies before letting them lie, and still, no one counted. If there had been a tally, if each leaf were marked, each fall observed, perhaps it would have offered some sense of order, some reassurance that things were happening on schedule, that the rhythms of the world still held. But now, without the watching, the fall of the leaves seemed softer, slower, even more ancient than before. Time was not recorded here. It was only felt, only implied, and the leaves, in their descent, made no argument for attention. They did not shout their arrival to the ground. They did not clamor to be known. They simply went, one after another, patient and unhurried. It was not a fall. It was a yielding. There was a tree outside the window, a tall one, older than any of the furniture inside. Its trunk split halfway up like an open palm. Its limbs stretched wide like something mid-thought. All year, it had held its foliage with quiet dignity, and now it let go just as gracefully. A few leaves remained near the top, clinging, but even they showed no tension. They would fall, too, in time. No one stood at the window to watch. None lifted the curtain. The leaves fell for no audience, and that made their fall feel even more honest. They were not note decorations. They were no metaphors, they were simply what happened. And in that space where no one counted, life continued, soft-footed and slow. The garden, if it could still be called that, wore the season like a shawl pulled closer against the shoulders. The grass had stopped growing. The flowers, long since spent, stood as dried husks, memories of color. Even the air smelled different, not of perfume or cooking or anything sweet, but of earth, faint decay, the deep rich scent of things returning to the soil. There was no melancholy in it, just quiet, just truth. Inside, the same rhythm echoed. The curtain stayed still. The books remained closed. A cup sat half full on the table, untouched for some time, its surface now calm, and mirror light, catching a fragment of branch and reflection. The clocks ticked, as they always did, but even they seemed softened by the day's hush. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no keys in the door, no laughter or questions or calls to dinner, just the steady fall of leaf after leaf, not urgent, not slow, but inevitable. Perhaps somewhere in a drawer was a notebook from years past, its pages filled with sketches of leaves, lists of varieties, dates, notes about when the maple turned yellow or the birch began to bare its limbs. A person had once taken great care to notice, not to name, to remember, and maybe, when they stopped, the trees noticed too. Maybe now, they shed in silence out of respect. Or maybe they'd never cared for observers at all. Maybe they dropped their leaves for no reason except that it was time, and reason had nothing to do with it. Still, there was something in the rhythm of it all, a softness that extended beyond the branches into the very breath of the place. The way the wind came and went without changing anything. The way the light filtered through the thinner limbs dappled the ground without urgency. The way nothing demanded action or reaction. The leaves fell, and that was enough. No need to name the tree or trace its lineage. No need to weigh the fallen leaves or measure the rate of descent. The beauty was not in the data, it was in the gesture, in the quiet surrender, in letting go. And it was not just the trees, it was the whole world, in miniature. The way old papers yellow in the attic, the way photographs curled at the edges, the way voices grew softer in memory. Everything, eventually, let go. The seasons did not rage against the shift. They eased into it with the grace of one leaf following another. And in that ease, there was something beautiful, not because it was dramatic, but because it asked for nothing. No record, no praise, no applause. Just as no one counted the leaves, no one counted the silences that followed. No one marked the pauses in conversation or the moments where thought drifted into stillness. And yet, those silences, like the fallen leaves, were part of the whole. They were not empty. They were not voids. They were resting in the music. They were the spaces where breath returned, where time was allowed to breathe. The earth does not mark each fallen leaf. It does not count how many have returned to its soil. It accepts them. It holds them. It folds them gently into itself until they become part of everything again. And maybe that is the most important part, the folding back. The way each unnoticed leaf becomes part of the root, part of the trunk, part of the next spring, even if no one sees it happen. Transformation doesn't require an audience. And so, the leaves fell. Not once, not twice, but endlessly, until the branches were bare and the ground was layered in quiet memory. No tally was kept, no ledger filled, but the trees knew, the earth knew, and perhaps in a part of the soul untouched by names and numbers. We noted that some of the most important things happen quietly, without announcement, without witness. That letting go does not need a ceremony to matter. The leaves fell, but no one counted Dan. That was not a loss. It was a kind of peace. They were not left by accident. That much was certain. These scarves, soft, familiar, folded and placed as though their use had merely been paused, occupied their chosen spaces with the kind of quiet presence reserved for things that once held purpose but had grown into something gentler, something beyond their original role. No longer shields against the wind, no longer draped hurriedly over shoulders before stepping out into cold air. They now lived in stillness, nestled into the rhythm of a home where time no longer announced itself loudly, where days flowed into one another like a slow river winding through a flat plain. One rested on the back of a wooden chair by the window, arranged with care not for style or display, but for nearness, as though someone had set it there with every intention of returning to it, not immediately, not urgently, but eventually. Another lay folded over the banister, its ends dangling just above the stairs, waiting like a bookmark at the edge of a chapter never turned. And there was one near the front door, always near the front door, coiled like a question. Will today be the day we go out? But no footsteps followed it. No coat was lifted from the hook beside it. Still, it remained, faithful to the possibility. They weren't dusted often anymore, but they also weren't neglected. Their folds were smoothed now and then, sometimes idly, sometimes deliberately, hands passing over the fabric not to clean or tidy, but simply to remember the act. The remembering was the point, even if the hands didn't always recall why they had gone to the scarf in the first place. The gesture remained intact. It was like muscle memory stitched into the fabric of the days. You could almost believe they carried echoes in their threads, faint imprints of the shoulders they'd worn, the laughter they'd brushed against, the cold mornings they'd braved with someone who moved quickly down a stone path or lingered on the porch a little too long, lost in thought. And even though they hadn't been worn in years, perhaps longer, they had not slipped into irrelevance. On the contrary, they had settled into something deeper. The stillness of a ritual remembered not by the mind, but by the home itself. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was a kind of quiet companionship. The scarves belonged to a rhythm now that had nothing to do with seasons or necessity. They were companions to the in-between, the pauses in the day when no one was speaking, when the light stretched across the walls in long, golden lines, when the only sound was the sigh of the floor as the house settled around its silence. Some mornings, the scarves would catch the sun just so, casting a faint shadow, a soft shimmer across the arm of a chair or the corner of a table, and for a moment, they would seem almost animate, almost expectant, not eager, but present. They held stories, but they didn't tell them. They were not theatrical. They were not the sort of objects that insisted on remembrance. But if you stood in the doorway long enough, looked at them just right in the slow hush of early afternoon, you could feel the weight of what they had witnessed. One had once caught a child's tears clutched in tiny fists after a scraped knee, its threads damp with quiet sobs. Another had been loaned across years to a neighbor in need, only to return months later smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume and foreign dust. One still carried the trace of lavender from a drawer sachet, tucked away carefully every summer and retrieved again in fall with the same gesture, the same reverence, year after year. And then there were the ones that never left the house at all, that had only ever lived indoors, draped and folded, adjusted and admired, placed not for warmth, but for presence, for ritual. In this house, where voices had grown softer and footsteps fewer, the scarves became timekeepers of a different kind, not counting minutes, not marking hours, but measuring patience, recording gentleness. They were still, but not stagnant, like a watch that had stopped ticking but still lay on the bedside table, its hands frozen at a meaningful hour, or a plant that no longer bloomed but was never removed from its pot. Their purpose had shifted, not disappeared. Their presence was enough. Some were knit by hand, their yarn uneven but tenderly looped. Others were store-bought, their tags now faded, tucked into corners like signatures half erased. Each carried the memory of a moment that no longer needed to be remembered in detail to be felt. The scarves became extensions of the self, not as adornment, but as reminders of how the self once moved through the world. They embodied movement now paused, breath now stilled. A scarf once tossed over a shoulder in a hurry to catch the post. A scarf tied carefully before attending a ceremony, unsure of what to expect. A scarf held in both hands at a door, twisted nervously during a goodbye that wasn't meant to be final. These were the kinds of stories that no longer had to be recounted aloud. They were held wordlessly, in fiber and fold. And it was not just the scarves. It was everything around them, too. The coat rack that hadn't been filled in years but still stood by the door like a sentinel. The umbrella was tucked beside it, long, dry, but never removed. The mirror, dulled at the corners, still reflecting the hallway in quiet vigil. All of it contributed to the tableau, the subtle suggestion that life was still here, still humming beneath the quiet, even if it had changed shape. The scarves were the softest part of that memory, the gentlest whisper in a room full of listening. There were days when a breeze would stir one slightly through a cracked window, or a draft that passed unnoticed until the fabric fluttered. And in those moments, it seemed as though the scarf might rise, might reach toward its former role, might leap again to the neck of someone about to step outside into the morning. But it didn't. It settled again, folding back into stillness, content to remain placed. Placed, that word mattered. Not thrown, not forgotten, but placed. A deliberate word, a word of quiet action, of care. And so they stayed, these scarves. Not for adornment, not for warmth, but for something else entirely, for continuity, for the beauty of stillness, for the comfort of routine that no longer needed justification. They were there as a promise, not that things would return to how they were, but that something of those days would always remain, that the house remembered, that the hand still moved, however slowly. That gesture itself was a kind of love. And one day, perhaps long from now, someone else might come into that space, might pause in the doorway, eyes catching on the scarf still folded just so. They might reach for it, unsure. They might lift it and feel its weight, light but undeniable. And they might smile, not because they understood, but because they sensed that something sacred had once happened here. Something small and repeated and gentle. And that the scarf, though unworn, had been part of it. Not a relic, but a witness. Not decoration, but devotion. Because sometimes the most beautiful things are not the ones we wear, but the ones we return to again and again, even if only to place them gently down. Scarves placed but never worn. Rituals remembered without being completed. Love expressed in the silence between acts. The sky darkened not abruptly, but with a slow certainty of something long approaching, a gradual folding in of light that made even the edges of things blur slightly. Trees softening at their outlines, rooftops sinking gently into the hush of dusk, and windows beginning to glow from within rather than reflect the world outside. The rain came as expected, as it always eventually does, but it came with restraint. Not in sheets or lashes, not with thunder or fury, but with a quiet insistence. That was almost an afterthought. A soft pattern of droplets, defined to name, too gentle to define, the kind of rain that doesn't fall with purpose but with presence. It drifted from the sky like breath, like a whisper shared from a very high place. And it found its way down through leaves and telephone lines and the bowed backs of clouds that had softened into themselves. But nothing below stirred. The rain came, yes, but it didn't touch anything, not really. It hovered just above the surface of the world, seeming to slow in the final inches of descent, as though it had changed its mind or remembered a promise to leave things be. The rooftops remained dry, their tiles dull and unbothered. The streets bore no glisten, the windows held no streaks, and yet the sound was there, the unmistakable hush of rain, the rustling like hands over linen, and the faint percussion of water against air. It was not imagined. It was simply separate, slightly removed, a presence that had arrived but chosen not to impose. Trees swayed gently, their branches moving not from the rain but from the anticipation of it. A kind of shared understanding that sometimes things come close and stay just far enough away to be noticed without being felt. The wind had quieted to make room. The air had thickened just slightly, the way it does before something begins. But the beginning never quite came. The rain continued to fall without falling, continued to be heard without being held, and continued to fill the space without ever landing fully. It was like music playing in another room, a familiar tune, whose notes you remember before they arrive and whose final chord never quite resolves. Inside, nothing needed to change. No doors were closed, no towels fetched, no windows shut against intrusion. The world inside remained as it had been, cups on the table, a book face down. She was waiting but not worn, and the gentle drift of hours unbothered by the faintest pulse of weather. The room did not darken further. The light from a low lamp stayed steady, unmoved by the passing clouds. And yet everyone noticed, even if they didn't move, even if they didn't say it. The rain had come, but not in the way that required a response. It had come more like memory does, or like music from long ago, brushing the senses with something soft and half-formed. The echo of something understood rather than the thing itself. It didn't soak. It didn't cleanse. It didn't gather in puddles or trickle through gutters or slap against the panes. It simply fell, or seemed to. Perhaps it was rain from somewhere else. Perhaps it had meant to land in another place and pass through here on its way. Or perhaps it was rain that needed only to be heard, not felt. The garden remained dry, the soil unchanged, the petals of the flowers holding their upright shapes without the weight of a single drop. The leaves did not shudder, nor curl, nor drink, and still the sound persisted. A gentle hush laid over the world like a veil, like the kind of quiet that follows a kind word, or the stillness that comes when someone leaves the room but their scent lingers. It was not eerie, not strange, but familiar in a way that could not be explained. The kind of rain one dreams about but doesn't wake up wet from. The kind of rain a memory might invent just to soften the edges of an evening. In a far corner of the room, a candle burned low, its flame steady, entirely unaware that anything unusual had arrived. The curtain did not move. The cat on the chair did not lift its head. And yet it was known. The rain was known by the floorboards that creaked ever so slightly, not in protest, but as if they had remembered being beneath an old roof on nights like this, by the glass in the window, cool now, even without the touch of wetness, by the air itself, which had taken on the clean hush of expectancy, as if everything were pausing, if only for a moment, to let the rain speak without interrupting it by receiving it. There are times, rare and gentle, when the world does not need to be changed by a thing in order to know it as real, when the touch isn't needed to believe in the nearness. And this was one of those times. The rain remained, falling without impact, a presence without imprint, and in doing so, it made room for something else, perhaps reflection, perhaps rest, perhaps the simple luxury of letting something pass by without clinging to it. It asked nothing. It required no shelter. It offered no disruption. It merely came and hovered above the world like a sigh that didn't land, and for that reason, everything felt more still than before. The shelves seemed to lean into their own silence. The pictures on the wall sat more gently within their frames. The spoon left in the teacup echoed nothing as it cooled. Time did not stop, but it bowed slightly. It moved more quietly, and the rain soft, separate, suspended continued, not ignored, not unwelcome, just untouched, not because it wasn't real, but because, like certain thoughts, it had chosen to arrive without requiring a reaction. It would leave in the same way. No puddles, no scent of wet earth, only the faintest trace of having been near. A kind of kindness, unspoken, the kind of rain that passes through you, not over you. There were fireplaces, tucked into the rooms of older homes where the walls leaned in slightly from time, and the windows sighed in winter, that still gave warmth but no longer held fire, no flicker, no blaze, no lakes of orange dancing against soot-black brick, just heat, steady and low, humming from behind grates or beneath old iron covers, as though the memory of flames had become enough, as though the act of burning had long ago been replaced by the quieter, less visible work of simply giving. And in this transformation, something strange and beautiful had happened. People began to gather as they always had, drawn by the promise of warmth. But they no longer looked for the center of it, no longer waited for the kindling to catch or the wood to crackle. Instead, they sat around it as one might sit around silence, around grief, around love that had grown beyond the need for spectacle. And in those rooms there was a softness, a kind of hush that didn't ask for stories or songs or even glances exchanged, just presence, just the steady companionship of heat without flame, warmth without source, as if the fireplace had evolved from a place of fire to a kind of heart that no longer needed to beat loudly to be felt. Its heat was not broadcast, not dramatic, but personal, subtle, the kind that crept through socks and sleeves, and settled in bones like old kindness, the kind that asked nothing in return. And though there were no logs to be stacked, no ashes to sweep, people still found themselves pausing as they passed, offering the same habitual glance they might have given a flame. And when they realized there was no flickering light to respond to, they didn't turn away in disappointment. They stayed and sat and breathed. And remember that comfort doesn't always come with spectacle. And not all warmth needs to be seen to be known. The fireplaces became something else entirely, not centers of activity, but centers of stillness. like sacred spaces in the home where the heat whispered rather than roared, where winter's edge was dulled not with fire but with patience. The children at first didn't understand, waiting for the red-orange dance to begin, asking when the fire would start, and the adults would smile softly, brush their hair back, and say, "It already has," and the children would press their hands close and feel it. Not the drama of flame, but the presence of care. And eventually they stopped asking, and began instead to curl up nearby without waiting, trusting that warmth would come not as a performance, but as a promise kept. And sometimes, in the darker months, when the outside wind clawed at windows and the world seemed quick and cold, these fireless fireplaces became the places people drifted toward, not for light, but for reassurance, for that simple radiance that didn't draw attention to itself. And in that way, the fireplaces taught something quietly radical, that to be warm did not require being bright, that to give could be invisible and still complete. That legacy might not come in sparks and ashes, but in the comfort someone reaches for instinctively, without thinking why. And there were moments, quiet ones, when someone would sit alone near the grate, knees drawn close, book left unread, and they'd feel it not the heat of combustion, but the weightless kindness of continuity. The idea that this fireplace had long ago moved past the need to prove itself and now simply was, giving warmth because that is what it chose to do, and perhaps because that is what the room needed most, not spectacle, but steadiness. And in this way, the fireplaces became part of the architecture of memory, not in photographs or grand designs, but in gestures, someone leaving a blanket folded neatly nearby, or setting a mug just close enough to stay warm, or placing a chair so that its legs tilted slightly toward the invisible heart of the home. And year after year, the fireplaces remained, never roaring, never glowing, never asking, only giving. And people came to know them not as cold things that had lost their spark, but as quiet ones that had learned to love in silence, to care without applause, to stay warm without burning. The sky didn't mark its changes because it did not need to. It was not beholden to the passage of time as clocks are, nor was it burdened by the necessity to announce its transformations like people so often are. It shifted without sound, without ceremony, without the slightest indication that anything different had occurred at all. If you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it entirely. If you were, you still wonder when exactly it happened, when the pale wash of morning became something deeper, something dimmer, something that stretched longer shadows across the yard. But the truth is, there was no moment, no single point at which one state ceased and another began. It just unfolded quietly, continuously, imperceptibly, like breath filling a room, or like a thought evolving in the background of your mind. The sky did not raise its hand to declare, "I am now afternoon," nor did it lower itself with a sigh and say, "This is evening." It simply transitioned gently, as if change were not something to fear or note or freeze in place, but something that just is. A process without a sharp edge, a becoming that doesn't interrupt. Even the colors did not arrive with distinction. They bled into one another in such subtle gradients that you couldn't say where one ended and another began. The blue of early morning was not the blue of noon, nor was it the blue of dusk, but they each held hands in the air, each one letting go of the last without grief. There were no sharp contrasts, no defining lines. The sky was a master of ambiguity, of soft, atmospheric hesitation, and below it, the world carried on as though it didn't notice, because in truth, it didn't. The trees stood tall and quiet, their leaves rustling not in reverence, but in indifference. The streetlights did not flicker on in coordination with the changing light. They did so by schedule, mechanically, and blindly. Inside the houses, lamps were turned on when eyes began to squint, when books became hard to read, not because someone had looked up and said, "Ah, the sky has changed," because the sky did not announce itself that way. It never does. It did not rage with color today. There were no brilliant oranges, no defiant purples, no explosions of rose or flame. Today, the sky moved with restraint. It preferred understatement. a gray that hovered just above blue, a pale gold so faint it might have been imagined, a silver-white glow near the horizon that flickered like the last memory of a dream. The clouds were soft and undefined, more suggestion than shape, like someone had exhaled gently across the surface of a painting and smudged the borders. They drifted with no particular destination, no urgency. There was no story in them, no promise of rain or threat of storm, just presence. An overhead reminder that not all things carry narrative. Some things simply are, and the sky was one of them. People walked beneath it without noticing. They passed under its endless stretch of softness and did not stop to look, because they were used to it, because it did not demand attention, and because in their hearts, maybe, they trusted that it would be there, doing what it does, even if no one was watching. The sky, after all, doesn't perform. It does not need applause. It does not yearn to be captured or remembered. It is vast and quiet and sure. Its identity is not threatened by indifference. Its worth is not defined by how many photographs it appears in. And so it changes without spectacle, without a scene, because it does not need to be known to exist fully. And yet, there are those moments, often uninvited, often when we are alone, when we do notice it. When something in us stirs and lifts our gaze. When we pause at a window, or stand still on the porch, or look up while walking home without meaning to. And in those moments, the sky is not just sky. It becomes a mirror, not one that reflects our face, but one that echoes our interior landscape. Its gray becomes our fatigue. Its stillness becomes our longing. Its subtle gold becomes the memory of something we can't quite name. And the lack of change, or rather, the way it hides its change, becomes a strange comfort. Because it tells us that change doesn't always need to be felt to be real. That some shifts happen without announcement. That some transformations are only visible in hindsight, and even then, only barely. The sky, today, did not tell us the hour. It didn't give us clues. It didn't lean toward the east or stretch itself then over the west. It simply held itself there, indifferent to our calendars and our countdowns. It made no effort to align with our timelines. And maybe that is why it unsettles us when we do look up, because it reminds us how artificial our divisions are, how arbitrary our slices of time. We say it is to p.m., and the sky says nothing. We call it this K, and the sky keeps moving, gently shrugging off all our labels. We measure with second S. It moves in hues. We rush. It lingers. We try to define it, but it defies. Beneath that unmarked sky, the world did not stop. A neighbor swept leaves from a driveway that would be covered again tomorrow. A child on a swing looked up just once, wondering if the clouds would drift into something he could name. Someone inside boiled water for tea and did not notice the light had dimmed by degrees since the kettle was last used. The sun, wherever it was, continued its arc in silence. The birds, knowing better than us, adapted without question. The animals did not panic at the change in tone, and maybe that is why the sky does not mark its changes, because it trusts us to adapt to. Or maybe it doesn't care whether we do. Maybe it knows we will, eventually. The sky is ancient, older than us, older than our thoughts, older than our naming of colors or our systems of time. It watched us crawl from caves and light fires. It watched us build cities and tear them down. It watched us measure it, chart it, divide it, name it sunset, dawn, twilight, high noon. But it was never any of those things. It never needed those names. Those were ours. The sky was just becoming, always becoming, and it still is. Without fanfare, without a milestone. Tonight, maybe, we'll look up again, and the stars will be there barely, or fully, or not at all. The sky won't tell us when they arrived. It won't point to the moment when light became dark. It won't say, now is the hour. It will just be as it always is, spacious, undefined, whole, and we will carry on beneath it, carrying our hopes, our aches, our longings, our weariness. And above us, unchanged and ever-changing, the sky will remain, refusing to be held by ours, refusing to be broken into pieces, teaching us quietly, Wordlessly, the transformation is not always something you see. Sometimes it is something you feel later. Sometimes it is something you become without realizing it. Sometimes it happened just like this, and a long, slow breath that no one notices until it's already gone. The door opened to the same thought, not because the thought was remarkable or new, or even particularly welcome, but because it had never truly left. It lingered like dust in corners or light caught between curtains, present not in sharpness but in repetition, quietly and patiently. It returned every time. Each morning, the hand on the doorknob paused for the briefest of moments, not out of hesitation, but ritual, as though the body already knew what the mind would find on the other side. There, beyond the wooden frame and the soft creak of the hinge, the world lay waiting, not dramatically different, not wildly unexpected, just waiting, in the way a sentence waits to be read again by someone who already knows the ending. And with it came the thought, soft but insistent, it's still the same. It was not a thought spoken aloud, but one that unfolded inwardly, with a slow rhythm of familiarity. The light falling through the windows hadn't changed its tone. The room's corners hadn't realigned themselves in the night. The floor was still greeted with the faint give of old boards under familiar steps. The air still carried the quiet weight of the hour before anyone had said anything. And so the thought, too, had nowhere else to go. It emerged with the opening of the door as naturally as a breath escapes lips not summoned, not resisted, simply there. The thought wasn't exactly tired, but it bore the tone of something long-lived. It wore the expression of a guest who had overstayed, not out of rudeness, but because no one had ever asked it to leave. This thought was not about change. It was about sameness, about the soft, unspoken continuity that exists in lives gently lived. It was about the way shoes land in the same spot on the mat, the way the morning light spills like water in the same angle pull across the table, the way certain chairs gather shadows while others reflect a kind of still glow. And in that sameness, there was something oddly sacred, not dramatic, not revelatory, but grounding. The kind of grounding that comes not from anchors, but from patterns, from gentle repetitions, from the quiet promise that things do not always fall apart overnight. The door opened, and with it came not just the thought, but the entire rhythm of a life shaped by such echoes. The kettle would be filled again. The same tea bag was chosen, even though others sat unopened in the box. The chair near the window would be pulled just slightly back to its favored spot. The calendar, largely untouched, would be glanced at without urgency, and none of it would feel wasteful. None of it would feel new. It would feel like it always does, and that, in its quiet way, was a comfort. It was a thought born not of boredom, but of presence, of the kind of attention that notices when the clock ticks one beat before the hour, when the fridge hums in that particular way. It always does at 8 a.m., when the wind doesn't arrive, and that, too, says something. It was a thought that knew where the corners of the day curled inward, that remembered which step on the stairs creaked in a different key. That person noticed the slight unevenness in the floor tiles and never resented it. It wasn't a thought of trying to change anything. It was simply the observing, a companion rather than a narrator. It did not need to analyze the sameness. It only needed to meet it, again and again and again. Some doors open into chaos, others into surprises, into people waiting, or urgent decisio, or harsh light. But this door opened into the quiet kind of repetition that holds a life together. The thought didn't rush ahead into memory or worry. It sat right at the threshold. It was the same because the door was the S. After all, the hallway was the same. After all, the life that moved through them had become a kind of echo chamber of its own making, steady, small, undisturbed. And still, within the sameness, there was room to breathe. Not everything repeated precisely. A glass left on the counter was placed slightly farther from the sink than usual. The curtain, caught slightly by the breeze, fluttered differently than the day before. The way the spoon clinked in the cup felt slightly off-tempo, and the thought noticed all of it, but without alarm, without attaching meaning. Because the thought did not fear monotony. It understood the music of small variations. It knew that sameness was never total, that no repetition is exact, even if it feels like it. It knew that behind the stillness, imperceptible shifts were always occurring, like slow tectonic plates beneath the crust of days. The door opened, and the thought welcomed what it already knew, that the day would be mostly like the one before it, that the world inside these walls would hold steady, that the echoes of the past would shape the present gently, not harshly. It knew where to look for softness. It knew which drawer stuck slightly and how to open it without resistance. It knew that the scent in the hallway was not of any specific perfume, but of warmth, of age, of the quiet persistence of living things. The thought greeted all of this not with amazement, but with recognition. It nodded internally. It had been here before, and though it might have seemed uneventful, that sameness was a kind of tapestry, one woven from years of subtle choices, from mornings like this one, where the door opened not to disruption, but to continuation, from small acts placing a book just so, folding the blanket the same way, choosing the same mug even though others were clean, from weathered floorboards and light fixtures that buzz quietly, but not disruptively, from the fact that even silence can develop character when heard often. Enough. The thought had become used to this landscape, as much a part of it as the ticking of the clock, the soft rustle of the curtain against the wall, the hum of the refrigerator. The door opened to the same thought, and the same thought came not because nothing ever changed, but because it had become easier, perhaps kinder, to live in rhythms rather than ruptures. And there was peace in that. Not resignation peace, the kind of peace that comes from living with time rather than against it, the kind that comes from noticing, deeply and quietly, that you are here again. And that is enough, because sometimes the most important truths are not the loudest. They are the ones you meet again and again at the beginning of each day, when the door opens to a world that did not clamor for your attention, but remained faithfully as you left it. They are the ones that say, gently, you are still here. This is still yours. And the thought that greets you at the door is not trying to tell you anything new. It is simply saying, welcome back. It was not a remarkable chair, not in its design, not in its placement. Its legs were plain, slightly uneven from years of being shifted and nudged across a wooden floor. The cushion, once firm, had long since yielded to the weight of habit and time. Its fabric faded from the original color into something softer, something gentler. A pale, lived-in tone that no longer announced itself but simply belonged like wallpaper that no one remembers choosing, or a curtain that always catches the same light in the same way. But this chair, though humble, held something no other object in the room could claim. It understood the shape of waiting. It had held silence longer than most things are asked to. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that grows out of repetition, the kind that becomes its own presence. This was the chair someone had once sat in every morning, always with the same rhythm, a hand on the back, a breath before lowering into it, and a glance toward the window, sometimes with tea, sometimes with nothing but thoughts. It remembered the pattern of the person who sat there, the slight lean to the right, the way the foot tapped softly on the floor during longer pauses in conversation, and the way fingers traced the edge of the armrest when words refused to come. Time had carved an indentation into its cushion that didn't bounce back. The fabric remembered even when the room forgot. The threads held echoes, and now, though no one sat in it regularly anymore, the chair still kept its posture. Still tilted slightly toward the window, still waiting. Chairs are built to support, but this one had gone beyond that. It had grown used to the role of holding not just weight, but presence. It had learned the art of catching the in-between between one decision and the next, between the start of a sentence and its ending, between the uncertainty of now and the imagined clarity of what might come next. It had become, over years, a quiet participant in the ritual of delay. There was a day once when the chair had been pulled close to the radio. The volume had been low, just a murmur of voices and static. The person who sat there had been listening not for news, but for familiarity. And even then, The chair had supported not only the listener's body but also their hope. Later, it had held someone who read a letter with trembling hands and did not speak afterward. That time, the sitting had lasted longer. Ours? Perhaps. The light had changed across the wall before the figure stood again, but the chair remained the same. Some days, it was saddened for only moments, just enough to tie a shoe, or sigh, or think of something left unsaid. Other days, it was occupied for hours, as if the person in it was not waiting for someone to arrive but for something to pass. Like a season, like a grief, like time itself. And now the chair mostly sat untouched, but that didn't make it idle. It faced the window still, not out of habit, but because something had told it that the waiting should be witnessed, that something might still happen. It did not demand, it did not creep, it simply remained, as chairs do, bearing the shape of what had been and leaving room for what might be. Once in a while, a guest would visit. They would glance at the chair, but choose another, as though they sensed that the waiting wasn't theirs, that it belonged to someone else, that the shape of the person who had once sat there was still present somehow, still hovering, still warm in a way that memory alone cannot explain. Other objects in the room had grown indifferent over time. The bookshelf, for instance, had accepted its role as a backdrop, its volumes lined and neat. Unread rows. The clock on the wall still ticked, but it no longer aligned itself with anything urgent. But the chair had a kind of quiet faith. It wasn't optimistic, not exactly. It didn't expect joy, but it did believe in continuity and ritual, and the kind of waiting that doesn't ache or yearn, but simply endures. There was a shawl once draped over its back. It had fallen off years ago and been folded and put away, but still, the outline remained. A slight difference in tone where the fabric had shielded the sun. A pale ghost of presence, and under one leg, a folded piece of paper kept the balance. No one remembered what had been written on it, but it remained because it worked. Because sometimes the temporary becomes permanent without needing a reason. The chair was not lonely. That's important to say. It didn't mourn. It didn't grieve. It didn't dwell. It simply held space, held time, held potential. It was not a monument, not a relic. It was something quieter than that, an anchor, maybe, or a pause stretched out over years. A comma that had never quite become a period. On rainy days, the chair seemed to listen more deeply. The soft percussion of drops on the window would make the room contract inward, make everything feel closer and softer. And the chair, in those moments, seemed to draw in breath, as if expecting someone to come back and sit, to resume the conversation that had been left off mid-thought. But no one came. Not that day, or the next. But the chair did not flinch. The waiting was never about the outcome. It was about the possibility. Sometimes, the house would creak at night, pipes shifting, air settling. And in those sounds, it was easy to imagine footsteps. It's easy to think that someone might come down the hallway, might round the corner, and might see the chair and sigh with relief, as if to say, "There you are. I've been meaning to come back." But those were just thoughts, just echoes. The chair did not rise to greet them. It held still. It had survived seasons. Winters that curled frost around the windows. Summers when the light stayed long after dinner time. Autumns that drifted leaves onto the porch, never quite swept away. Springs that smelled of newness the chair no longer needed. It had been there for all of them, unchanging, a sentinel to the ordinary, a vessel for the forgotten pause. And though its cushion had worn thin and its arms had dulled with the touch of time, it had never broken, never splintered. It bore its scars with quiet dignity. The scratch along its leg where someone had dropped a book in haste. The loosened joint where it had once been moved in frustration. The subtle stain on the cushioned coffee, maybe, or ink. These were not flaws. These were proof, not of use, but of presence, of a life once lived near it, with it. Even now, when no one sat there, when days passed with no interaction, the chair remained a kind of memory made physical, a promise carved into wood and thread and time, a testament to the idea that not all things must move to matter. Some things become important precisely because they stay. And maybe one day, long from now, someone will choose to sit again. Not because they know the history, not because they recognize the waiting, but because something about the chair will feel right, familiar, quiet, honest. And when they do, the chair will not sigh, will not shift. It will simply do what it has always done: support, hold, and endure. Because the chair was never just furniture. It was never just an object in a room. It was a place where time was allowed to pause without guilt. A vessel where worry could be placed and left behind. A witness to the way a life unfolds slowly. Not in great sweeps of drama, but in the still, patient repetition of days. And in that way, it knew the shape of waiting better than anyone. The chair did not ask questions. It did not look for meaning. It was enough, simply, to remain. The kettle had whistled once already that morning, a thin ribbon of sound curling into the quiet of the house like a polite question. No one felt in a rush to answer. And then, just as quickly, the sound faded, the steam slipped upward into nothing, and the silence folded back in, gently erasing the interruption. In the kitchen, the mug waited patiently, a favorite one, perhaps chipped at the rim. Perhaps not, but certainly familiar, worn not by misuse, but by 1,000 small kindnesses offered to no one in particular. The tea bag rested nearby, its paper tag curled from memory or from humidity, its string like a loose thread on the hem of something well worn. And yet, despite everything being in its place, mug, kettle, steam, leaf, the tea was never poured. The moment passed not rudely, but quietly, as though it had simply mistaken the time. A footstep in another room pulled thought away. A memory wandered in from nowhere. A phone buzzed and was ignored. The tea, brewed with intention, stood waiting and was left to cool, untouched. And the day continued, with its small, slow hours stitched together not by events, but by spaces, pauses in which nothing much happened, but during which time gently turned anyway. Later, how much later is unimportant, the process began again. The kettle was lifted with the same habitual care, filled not with ceremony, but with a subtle weight of routine, that unspoken choreography of hands that know the angle, the heft, and the familiar spot on the stove where heat collects just a little quicker. The switch clicked, the red light came on, steam rose again, and the whistling, soft as breath through an old flute, returned. And again, the tea was steep. Perhaps a different flavor this time, or perhaps the same chamomile, Earl Grey, or mint, no matter. It bloomed in the water, lazy spirals of color unfolding like thoughts you don't mean to have but follow anyway. The spoon rested on the counter, unused. The steam climbed again, curling in the air like a half-spoken thought. And then, again, the cup was left untouched, not with neglect, but with a kind of gentle forgetting. As though the tea had been made only for the sake of making it, not for drinking. It sat, quiet and still, like someone waiting in a room who doesn't mind if they're never called in. This was not a mistake. This was a rhythm, a soft repetition that had no urgency and no consequence. The tea cooled, then cooled further, and then, without notice, it became part of the room, like the chair it sat beside. Like the calendar on the wall that no one had turned in weeks. Like the bowl of fruit, half fresh, half fading, still decorative in its insistence on staying. The tea was brewed, forgotten, and brewed again, not out of confusion, but out of habit. A gentle loop, a kind of private liturgy spoken only in the language of kettles and cups, of water heating and cooling without ever needing to be consumed. In this house, in this hour, in this life, the ritual was enough. The act of preparation was the point. The tea did not need to be drunk to have mattered. There was something sacred in that, the making of something for no one, the offering with no recipient, the way a garden still blooms even if no one walks through it, the way a lullaby can still exist in a mother's mind long after the child has grown. The world is full of gestures that never reach their intended end, and yet they are not wasted. A candle was lit and then left to burn alone. A bed made, then never slept in. A letter written, then never sent. These things, like the tea, contain a kind of reverence. A quiet insistence on meaning, even when meaning isn't required. And so the cup sat. The first one, the second one, perhaps a third on another day. The mugs rotated like thoughts returning in soft circles. No urgency, no impatience, just the cycle of warmth and cooling, of beginning again. And in that rhythm was a kind of music, one that required no instrument. The clink of the kettle lid, the soft swoosh of water, the hum of heat, the sigh of steam. A symphony in the smallest of moments, an orchestra for no audience. It was not laziness, it was not forgetfulness, it was presence, expressed through pause. Sometimes life is not made of what we complete, but what we return to. Again and again, the tea was brewed because it felt like something to do, a way to say, I am here, I am still tending, I am still capable of warmth, even if no one tastes it, even if I forget. The act itself stands, quietly, undemanding. The tea is its own comfort, whether touched or not. Some days, the brewing of tea is a conversation, not with anyone present, but with memory, with grief, with silence. The kettle boils and echoes across the tiled floor like a question from someone. Who used to sit at the table? Do you still drink yours with sugar? The tea answers back not with words, but with scent. A warmth that fills the room even if no one steps into it. And sometimes, the tea is made because it once brought someone joy. Because the cupboard still holds their favorite blend. Because you remember the sound they made when sipping. Or the way their fingers wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing that knew their name. And so you brew it for them. Even if they're not there. Especially if they're not there. Or perhaps, more simply, it is the action that matters. To fill, to heat, to pour, to wait. These steps ground a person. The kettle whistles, and time bends around that sound, holding space for something to matter. The pouring of water becomes a tether. The soft dunking of the bag is a moment of control in a world that otherwise spins. To make tea is to say, I am still choosing. I am still trying, even if I forget to finish. Even if the tea grows cold. Even if the morning turns to afternoon and then to dusk, the cup remains untouched on the side table. No one asks the tea to complain. It never does. The mug never resents its use. The kettle is always willing. The tea waits, then waits again. It has nowhere else to be. Like certain thoughts, like certain hopes, the kind we don't always hold in the front of our mind, but which sits quietly in a drawer just beneath, folded neatly, waiting. Just like that tea, brewed, forgotten, brewed again. It isn't a failure. It's a kind of faithfulness. A promise repeated, even when no one hears it. A small gesture that says, I am trying to care, even if I'm not sure for whom. Sometimes, we brew tea not to drink, but to feel like we've made space for comfort to exist. The warmth in the cup is a kind of echo, a softness. It becomes the warmth we wish we could feel more clearly in the center of the day. A proxy for peace, a placeholder for presence. And when finally, if ever someone takes a sip, whether it's the same person or someone else, whether the tea is still warm or room temperature or even gone slightly bitter from oversteeping, it still carries with it the weight of the ritual. It holds the memory of intention, of pauses and returns, of moments almost shared. The tea, brewed again, is never just a beverage. It is memory. It is a habit. It is care you can hold. So let the tea cool. Let it be forgotten. Let it be brewed again. Each time, it will hold something of the one before. Each cup is a soft echo of the ones left behind. A quiet lineage of care. Because the world doesn't always need urgency. It doesn't always need a conclusion. Sometimes, it only needs the kettle to sing again, the steam to rise again, and the tea to bloom in still water again just once more. And again. It was the sort of thing you wouldn't notice. Unless you'd been watching for longer than anyone really does anymore. A clock hanging on a wall, slightly faded from sunlight, its ticking muffled by layers of time and wallpaper and the general hush that settles over houses that have learned how to wait. But there it was, quietly undeniable, in that still, almost hesitant alignment, the hands of the clock, both of them pointing the same way, layered upon each other so closely that they looked like one indistinguishable at a glance, as though time had paused in its stride. Not abruptly, not with drama, but with the deep and lasting calm of something that had simply decided not to move forward for a while, and perhaps it was coincidence. The kind that happens 60 times a day if you care to check. And yet in that moment in that room where the air seemed to exhale, instead of rush, it felt like something more like the universe had tucked itself in for a moment, let all its spinning and straining soften into stillness, and rested just briefly on the narrow line where past and future are indistinct, where all motion narrows into pause, and everything, every possibility, every memory draws inward and folds itself neatly into the space between seconds. The clock for once did not seem to measure time, but to hold it gently, without pressing forward. And the longer you looked at it, the more you realize how little of life actually required movement to be meaningful. How much of our days are filled not by what we do, but by the spaces in between. Doing the quiet glances, the silent thoughts, the pauses we rarely allow ourselves to fully inhabit. And in that moment when the hands pointed together like to people who had finally stopped arguing and agreed just to stand still, the room felt different, full somehow of something wordless and unmoving, as if everything had lined up just for a moment, the light falling exactly between curtain folds, the dust drifting in time with your breath, the hum of the refrigerator in the next room synchronizing with your pulse. And perhaps the clock wasn't broken, and time wasn't paused, and nothing was actually different. And yet, it was, because what the clock showed was not just a moment in time, but a moment out of time, a reminder that sometimes all the movement we chase is only noise, and what matters waits for us in stillness. And maybe that's why no one rushed to fix it, why no one reached for the winding key or checked the batteries, or tapped the glass with the usual impatience. Because they felt somewhere deep in their bones that the clock had given them a gift, a sliver of existence unmarred by forward motion, a quiet agreement between seconds, a chance to simply be rather than become. And so the clock remained just like that for hours, maybe days, maybe longer. No one could say exactly, its hands resting like twin truths finally aligned, like thoughts that had settled in agreement, like prayers that had already been answered without needing to be spoken. And each time someone passed by it, they paused, even if only for a second, and let that stillness wash over them, the way warm water might soothe a trembling hand. And they moved on, not hurriedly, not fully aware, but softened, as though a part of them had been gently convinced that everything might be okay, not because it was resolved or repaired or finished, but because something somewhere had stopped rushing. And for a brief and breathless moment, they too were allowed to stop. And in that stopping, the world didn't fall apart, it simply waited, and in the waiting it breathed. And in the breathing it remembered itself, not as a collection of ticking minutes and scheduled demands, but as a soft unfolding story where some of the most important chapters are the ones where nothing seems to happen. And the clock's hands, still resting one atop the other like old friends reunited, became not a failure of mechanics but a gesture of grace, a small, silent invitation to pause long enough to feel what you've forgotten to name. The curtains knew when to move without being touched, not because they were alive in the way we understand life, but because they had learned something that people rarely do, the art of responding without needing a reason. They hung there with the grace of something patient, suspended in soft folds, waiting without agenda, listening in their own way to the world as it shifted around them. They did not need wind in its most obvious form to ripple, no dramatic gust, no sweeping breeze announced their sway. Instead, they moved when silence changed shape, when the room exhaled, when something unnameable passed through the air, something smaller than sound, lighter than dust. They moved because the day was different, even if no one could see how. They moved because a thought, unsaid, had just drifted out of someone's mind and across the floor. They moved because stillness, when it becomes too deep, must be broken gently, and only for a moment. The light had not shifted much, but the curtain stirred anyway, lifting a little from their post along the window frame as though they'd been waiting for just the right second. They fluttered like a sigh turned into fabric. Their hemline rose and fell, barely brushing the sill, then retreated again, like a wave that knew how to come close without overwhelming. You might think it was nothing if you weren't paying attention, just a draft, just a loose seam in the house's old design. But those who watched carefully would know this movement was not casual. It was rhythmic, intuitive, nearly aware. It had the timing of something in conversation with the unseen. They were old curtains creased from years of being pulled back and let down, sun faded at the edges, stitched in a pattern so subtle it looked like memory rather than design. They had seen countless mornings and just as many nights. They had felt summer heat clinging to their threads and winter chill stiffening their folds. They had watched people come and go, watched arguments rise and fall, watched laughter echo off the walls, watched silence settle like dust over everything. They had been there when babies cried and when those same babies grew quiet with age. And still, they hung still. They moved not always, but just when the moment called for it. Not when someone asked, but when something in the room seemed to require it. Sometimes, their movement was a kind of punctuation, a pause in the narrative of the day. The flick of their edge, the soft curl inward, the slow unfurl toward the light. It was a response, not to the wind, but to emotion. When someone sat down heavily in a chair after hearing hard news, the curtains moved not to distract, but to comfort, like a companion shifting closer. When a person stood by the window, lost in a memory they couldn't name, the curtains rustled slightly, acknowledging the weight of what wasn't said. When no one was in the room at all, and the house seemed to fold into itself in quiet sleep, the curtains moved then too, as though dreaming alongside the walls. They were never showy in their movements. They did not billow dramatically unless truly summoned by the weather. Most of the time, they merely trembled at the edges, a little lean, a little quiver, just enough to suggest that the air was alive with something unseen. Sometimes it was the breath of memory. Sometimes it was grief that hadn't yet become tears. Sometimes it was simply the weight of time, brushing past on its way to somewhere else. And always, the curtains responded, not with noise, not with words, but with presence, with the language of fabric, knowing its place in the room and fulfilling it gently. There were days when their stillness was equally eloquent, when the room was heavy with quiet, and even the curtains knew not to move. Days when someone sat there, staring, waiting, hoping, but the curtains remained still, as if to say, now is not the time to ripple. Now is the time to hold still, like you. They had an intuition for balance. They were part of the rhythm of the home, not separate from it. Not decoration, not afterthought, but a kind of quiet witness. They measured the hours not in minutes, but in light, dot, and tone, and feeling, in the collective breath of the room they lived in. And in their memory, yes, the curtains had memory in the way fabric does. They held all the sunrises that had ever passed through the window. They remember the long, stretched out days of summer when the light poured in golden and forgiving, making even the dust motes shimmer like notes in a song. They remember the sharp, slanted light of late autumn, the kind that entered like a blade and made the room feel lonelier than it had the day before. They remembered nights when the only glow came from street lamps outside, or the slow blink of a distant airplane overhead. They remembered shadow, to the deep blue kind that creeps up around the corners before evening is fully allowed in. And in each of these memories, they had moved, slightly, as if nodding, as if agreeing that yes, this too would pass, and they would be there to greet the next change. Something is reassuring about that something in the room knows what to do without being asked, that something responds to the invisible, to the feeling rather than the fact. In a world so structured around control, around scheduling, around measuring and tracking, the curtains remained free from all of it. They answered to something softer. They moved not for performance, not for attention, but because the room called for movement and they knew how to answer. Visitors often didn't notice. They walked through the room quickly, said polite things, complimented the wallpaper or the view, and left without ever realizing the curtains had moved. But the people who stayed, who sat in that room day after day, who carried their quietness like a shawl, who thought more than they spoke, they noticed. And in moments when the air shifted ever so slightly, when a sentence ended and left behind a silence too large to fill, they'd glance at the curtains, and often the curtains would stir then, like a friend nodding slowly in the corner, saying, "I heard that, too." Not every movement needed meaning. Sometimes the curtains just moved because they could, because the air nudged them playfully, because the sun had changed angles, and it tickled their threads just enough. But even in those times, their motion felt deliberate, like they were enjoying being part of something, a soft ballet of elements, where light, air, and fabric held hands and danced briefly through the space between seconds, then settled again, folded into stillness, not asleep, just waiting. And when night came, as it always did, the curtains changed character entirely. They became guardians of darkness, not ominous, but gentle. They held the outside out and the inside in. They thickened with shadow, became velvet in the half-light, absorbing the room's hush. They were drawn closed sometimes by human hands, but even when left open, they seemed to close inward slightly, as if acknowledging the end of the day. They did not move much then, not unless called by something stronger. But even then, they knew when. A breeze at midnight might slip past the latch of a half-closed window, and the curtains would lift just once, like a sigh in reverse, then fall back, silent, trusting the night to keep watch alongside them. And the beauty of it all was this: they asked for nothing, no recognition, no remark. They did not need to be cleaned often or praised for their endurance. They simply were moving when movement was called for, still when stillness served better. Always in tune with what was present, never ahead of the moment, never behind it. They had no ego, no expectation, just instinct, just awareness, just a deep, woven knowing that sometimes the best way to be in the world is to listen first and move second. When you feel the need rise from the room like a pulse, like a whisper, like a thread tugging gently at the edge of your hem. And so they stayed and swayed and settled, unbothered by time, undisturbed by change, waiting, always, for the next unspoken moment, the one no one else would see coming, when the room would exhale again. And they would lift just a little, just enough, because the world had moved a fraction. And there is a quiet surrender in the idea that the fields grew wild, unchecked, and untended. Fields once carefully plowed, planted, and maintained carry with them the essence of human effort, care, and the rhythm of seasons. To see them left to grow wild is to witness a relinquishing of control, a yielding to nature's slow reclamation. Fields, by their very nature, are spaces of intention. They are shaped and molded by hands and tools, by plans and labor, crops planted in straight lines. Weeds are pruned, boundaries marked, every stalk cut, every furrow turned. Speaks to a relationship between humans and the earth that is deliberate and purposeful. The fields are not just soil and seed, they are a canvas of human will and hope. But when the fields grew wild, that human will had loosened its grip. The neat rows dissolve into tangles of grasses, brambles, and untamed growth. Nature, no longer guided or restrained, takes over in its own time and way. The wildness is not violent or sudden. It is gradual, patient, and inevitable. The phrase "and no one trimmed them" deepens the sense of abandonment. Trimming is an act of care, but also of maintenance and order. It is a way of shaping growth, of setting limits, of preventing chaos from creeping in. Without trimming, the fields become a living metaphor for what happens when vigilance fades, when the demands of cultivation and attention give way to quiet neglect. This neglect may not be a conscious choice. It might not be rebellion or despair. It may simply be the result of absence, of hands once busy, now empty, of bodies once present, now gone. The fields grow wild not because someone wanted them to, but because no one remained to keep them at bay. Yet, wildness is not just loss. It is also freedom. The wild fields hum with life, grasses sway in the breeze, wildflowers bloom in riotous colors, insects buzz, and birds sing. The unchecked growth is a kind of flourishing, albeit one that follows nature's rules rather than humanity's. In the wild, the earth breathes without constraint. It weaves its own tapestry of survival and renewal. In literature and in life, wild fields often symbolize the tension between order and chaos, between civilization and nature. Here, They embody a world in transition, a place where human presence has retreated, and nature steps forward. The wildness is neither good nor bad. It simply is an honest testament to the passage of time and the shifting balance of care. The absence of trimming also echoes the larger themes woven throughout Part 1, the slowing of time, the fading of ritual, and the quiet withdrawal from previously maintained routines. Just as the bell is no longer rung with urgency, the door no longer echoes, and the chair remains facing a view that asks for no attention, so do the fields lose their tended edges. There is something both melancholy and beautiful about this state, melancholy, because the fields remind us of what has been lost, the people who work the land, the rhythms that once governed life, and the shared effort that shaped community and survival. Beautiful, because the wildness also points toward resilience and renewal. Life continues, even without intervention. The earth does not lie fallow in defeat. It grows, shifts, and adapts. This growth without trimming invites us to reconsider our ideas of care and neglect. What does it mean to care? Is it always about control and order? Or can care sometimes mean stepping back, allowing space for wildness, for untamed growth? The wild field suggests that absence can be a kind of presence, a presence that makes room for change. For different forms of life and beauty, the fields grew wild, and no one trimmed them is also a quiet statement about memory and forgetting, just as the names carved in stone fade faster than the stone itself. And as the dust gathers in patterns no one recognizes, the cultivated landscape slowly dissolves into something new and unfamiliar. It reminds us that the marks we make on the world are fragile, temporary, and subject to time's inexorable flow. Yet, within this surrender is a form of peace. The fields are no longer contested spaces. They are no longer battlegrounds of labor and expectation. They exist as part of a larger, slower cycle, a cycle that includes growth, decay, and rebirth in ways that surpass human intentions. In this way, the wild fields become a symbol for the entire Part 1, a world where echoes fade, where rituals soften, and where time no longer demands loud declarations but unfolds in quiet, persistent continuities. The fields do not cry out for attention. They do not resist the loss of order. They grow wild, and in the wildness, they carry the whisper of life's enduring pulse. A child's question, simple and pure, carries with it the weight of curiosity that has not yet been burdened by the assumptions or complexities of the world. When a child points at a weather vane and asks, "What's that for?" they invite us to see again, through their eyes, a world where everything has meaning, or perhaps is still waiting to have it discovered. The question is not just about the object itself, but about our relationship to understanding, to tradition, and to the passage of time. The weather vane, perched high atop a rooftop or a tall pole, is an old sentinel of the skies. It turns slowly, obedient to the whims of the wind, indicating its direction without fanfare or complaint. For many, it is a quaint relic, a decorative feature seen but not truly noticed. But for a child, it is a mysterious spinning arrow pointing somewhere, always moving, always responding to something unseen. It begs an explanation. When the child asks, "What's that for?" the question echoes beyond the physical object. It asks about purpose in a broader sense. Why do we create things? Why do we watch the wind? Why do we care about directions and changes we cannot see directly? The weather vane becomes a symbol of human attempts to understand and anticipate the forces shaping life. Weather, fate, and chance. It is a tool of interpretation, turning invisible currents into visible signs. To answer a child's question about a weather vane is to bridge past and present, to share stories of lives shaped by seasons and storms, by winds that bring rain or sun. It is to recount how people once depended on such devices to decide when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for cold nights. The weather vane is part instrument, part storyteller, telling silent tales of shifting skies. But beyond practical purpose, the child's question invites a reflection on how we teach meaning. How do we pass down knowledge? How do we explain the world in ways that invite wonder rather than merely instruction? The weather vane is a touchstone for this process. It asks us to slow down and notice, to recognize that some answers are as much about connection as they are about facts. In this moment of asking, the child reminds us of the importance of curiosity, how it propels us forward, keeps us engaged with the world, and opens the door to learning. It is a reminder that many things we accept as given were once unknown, once mysteries waiting to be explored. The weather vane also stands as a metaphor for change and constancy. Though it turns with the wind, it remains fixed in place. It is both dynamic and stable, a paradox that mirrors life itself. To a child, this paradox might seem magical or puzzling, a silent dancer always in motion, yet forever anchored. There is a gentle invitation in the child's question to see the ordinary as extraordinary, to find meaning in the small and the overlooked. It calls us back to a time before explanations became complicated or assumptions hardened. It encourages a way of being in the world that is open, attentive, and humble. In answering, we might speak of winds and weather, of seasons turning, of human ingenuity. But we also honor the child's voice, the way that question breaks through routine and reminds us to wonder. The child's gaze lifts us to look upward, to the spinning weather vane, and through it to the vast sky beyond, unseen, unpredictable, and full of possibility. And so, the weather vane, once just a tool, becomes a symbol of curiosity, connection, and the simple beauty of asking why. It reminds us that every object, every tradition, carries stories waiting for someone to ask and listen. There is a profound weight in the act of whispering a name. A name is the essence of identity, a marker of presence and connection. To whisper it is to speak it softly, intimately, perhaps in hope or memory. Yet the silence that follows no response, no acknowledgement, transforms the tender act into something heavy, almost haunting. The scene evokes isolation, absence, forgottenness, and the delicate boundary between being remembered and being lost. A whisper is a fragile sound, a breath carried gently through air. It is often reserved for moments of secrecy, reverence, or emotion, too delicate for loud speech. When someone whispers a name, it is as if they are reaching across an invisible divide. They call out not to the world, but to memory, to spirit, or to a presence that once was. It could be a name uttered in longing and sorrow, or in hope, perhaps a way to summon a ghost of the past, or to keep alive a connection slipping through the fingers of time. The absence of response, and no one responded, deepens the scene's poignancy. It suggests that the name belongs to someone who is no longer present in the living world, or who has been forgotten by those around. The silence might be literal, no one hears or answers. Or it might be metaphorical, no one acts on the memory, and no one carries forward the story. The name hangs in the air, unclaimed, unreturned. This moment encapsulates the tension between presence and absence, between memory and oblivion. To whisper a name is to insist on its significance. To receive no response is to confront erasure. The scene confronts the fragile nature of human memory and the painful reality that even names our most fundamental markers of self can fade, be lost, or be ignored. The social dimension here is crucial. Names are not only personal, they are social connectors. They link individuals to communities, histories, and stories. When a name is whispered and no one responds, it signals a rupture in that social fabric. It is a moment of disconnection between people, between past and present, and between the self and society. The silence might reflect grief too deep to speak, shame too heavy to acknowledge, or indifference born of forgetting. In many cultures, speaking a name aloud is a way to honor the dead, or to invoke protection or remembrance. Conversely, silence can indicate taboo, pain, or denial. This line evokes all those layers. The whisper is an act of remembrance or calling out, and the lack of response is a refusal or inability to engage. The emotional tone is layered. On one hand, there is loneliness, the desperate hope that someone might answer. the connection might be restored. On the other, there is resignation or mourning, the recognition that the name is now an echo in an empty room. The whisper itself becomes a kind of lament, a solitary ritual that acknowledges loss and absence without resolution. The setting for such a moment might be quiet, a room where shadows lengthen, a hallway empty except for fading footsteps, or a crowd distracted by their own silences. The whisper is like a fragile thread cast into a void, hoping to catch on something, someone, or anything. This line also speaks to the universal human fear of being forgotten. We all desire to be named, known, and remembered. Names are the anchors of identity, and the idea of calling out a name into silence evokes the terror of erasure. The whisper is a fragile assertion of existence, a last effort to be acknowledged in a world that moves relentlessly onward. Literary traditions have long explored the power of names. In myth and folklore, knowing a true name is power. Names carry magic. To lose a name is to lose oneself. This line taps into the deep symbolism, portraying the whispered name as a vulnerable act that is met only with void. On a psychological level, the scene can represent the internal struggle with loss or trauma. The whispered name might be the memory of a loved one, a piece of the self that is fading, or a part of the past that refuses to be forgotten. The silence becomes an internal void, a space where memory exists but is unshared, unacknowledged. Yet, even in the silence, the whisper itself holds power. It is a refusal to let the name disappear completely, though no one responds. The act of speaking it keeps the memory alive, however faintly. It is a fragile flame flickering in a dark room, a testament to the endurance of memory despite neglect. This moment also invites reflection on community and collective memory. How do societies choose whom to remember and whom to forget? Which names are spoken and which silenced? The silence in response to the whispered name may reflect broader social dynamics of exclusion, marginalization, or historical erasure. In summary, the line "someone whispered a name and no one responded" encapsulates a profound meditation on memory, loss, identity, and the human need for connection. It is a moment suspended between hope and despair, presence and absence, and sound and silence. The whisper carries the weight of longing and the courage to remember, while the silence speaks of forgetting and the fragility of human bonds. This sentence captures a moment that feels both ordinary and deeply significant. A single, creaking sound from an old weather vane after a long silence. The word finally tells us this creak was long awaited, suggesting a pause, a stillness, or perhaps a dormancy that has stretched on for some time. The sound itself, a creak, is subtle, imperfect, and almost reluctant, yet it carries weight. A weather vane is a symbol of change and movement, its very purpose to respond to the wind, to point the way, to signal shifts in weather and, metaphorically, in life and time. When it has been silent, still, and unmoving, it suggests a world paused, a sense of suspended time or forgotten purpose. The finally hints that this stillness has not been natural but enforced, awaiting for some change or stir. The fact that the creak happened again implies that the weather vane once sang and moved freely, but then fell silent, dormant, and almost forgotten. The creak is a sign of awakening, the first groan of old metal stirred back into life by a breeze, by time, or by something unseen. It is not a loud, triumphant noise, just a single, hesitant creak, but its very subtlety makes it profound. This moment marks a shift. The creak is a signal that stillness is breaking, that the world or the place is breathing again. It's like the first sigh after a long pause, the first heartbeat after quiet. The single creak reminds us that change often begins softly, without spectacle, with small noises that ripple outwards. The word once adds a finality and delicacy. It was not a sustained return to movement, but a solitary creak, a quiet reminder of life's persistence. It might be the start of a larger stirring or simply a lone echo that fades again into silence. Either way, it holds the attention because it is rare and meaningful. The weather vane's creak can also symbolize the fragile threshold between past and present, between memory and moment. It reminds us that time and change are always present, even when hidden beneath layers of quiet and dust. The creak breaks the silence, calling attention to what has been waiting beneath. Ultimately, this line is about the gentle awakening of a world, the soft stirrings of time, and the beauty of small, imperfect signs of life. It honors the quiet moments that signal renewal, even when they come as a single, hesitant sound. The phrase "and then it stopped" is deceptively simple, yet laden with profound significance. And just for words, it encapsulates the sudden, sometimes inevitable cessation of motion, sound, or life itself. It invites us to pause and reflect on what it might be and on the nature of stopping itself, whether as an ending, a moment of stillness, or a threshold between what was and what might be. To begin with, the pronoun "it" is deliberately vague, open to interpretation. This ambiguity invites the reader to fill in the blank with whatever it means in the context. Whether the ticking of a clock, the ringing of a bell, the turning of the wind, the beating of a heart, or the ongoing movement of a life. By withholding specifics, the phrase becomes universal. It could be a machine faltering, a story coming to a close, or a breath held in suspense. This openness deepens its resonance, making it a reflection on cessation and many forms. The word then situates the stopping within. Tom, there was no motion, sound, or action before. There was continuation, expectation, or progression. And suddenly, at a certain point, that flow was broken. That marks the moment of transition, the turning point between going and ceasing. It is a punctuation in the narrative of existence. To stop is a complex verb. It can mean to end, to pause, to rest, or to die. Stopping can be voluntary or involuntary, welcome or feared, peaceful or jarring. In nature, stopping is part of cycles. Night stops the day, winter stops the growth of spring, and sleep stops waking. In human experience, stopping carries weighty emotional meaning. Stop working, stop talking, stop loving, stop living. In literature and art. And then it stopped is often the final line in moments of suspense or climax. It signals an abrupt silence after noise, a stillness after movement, and a quiet after chaos. It can be shocking or soothing, depending on context. Imagine a scene unfolding, the sound of footsteps echoing down a hall, growing closer, then fading away. The creak of a door swinging on old hinges. The steady ticking of a clock that measures time in patient, rhythmic beats. And then, suddenly silence. The footsteps stop, the door ceases its moan, and the clock no longer ticks. The world seems to hold its breath. The suddenness of the stop breaks the flow of expectation, leaving a space pregnant with uncertainty. This phrase evokes the physical sensation of abruptness. Think of the moment when music suddenly ceases, and the room is filled with stunned quiet, or when a train screeches to a halt, and the passengers lurch forward. The sudden cessation of motion or sound catches attention and forces awareness. And then it stop captures that immediate shift from movement to stillness, sound to silence. Emotionally, stopping is a moment of reckoning. It invites reflection. It can be a relief when pain stops, when suffering ends, when turmoil calms. Or it can be a loss when laughter stops, when life stops, when hope stops. The phrase encapsulates all these contradictions, holding within it both peace and grief. In the context of time, stopping challenges the flow of progression. Time, as we understand it, moves forward relentlessly, unstoppable. Yet moments of stopping pauses, breaks, silences remind us that time is experienced subjectively. When something stops, our perception of time shifts. The moment stretches or compresses. We become acutely aware of the passage or absence of time. Philosophically, stopping can be a gateway. The moment before stopping is a threshold, a place between what was and what might be. It is a space of potential transformation. To stop is to leave something behind, to break a pattern, to interrupt a narrative. It opens the possibility for new stories to emerge or for silence to deepen. The phrase also resonates with the finality of death, the ultimate stop. Death is the cessation of biological function, the end of conscious experience. To say "and then it stopped" in that context is both simple and devastating. It reminds us of the fragility of life, of the inevitability of endings, yet within that stop, there is also a mystery: what comes next, if anything, in a more mundane sense. And then it stopped might describe the failure of a machine, the breaking of a habit, or the end of a relationship. Each of these endings carries with it a range of feelings: frustration, relief, sadness, and hope. The phrase holds space for all of these. There is also a poetic beauty in the simplicity of the line. It is direct and unadorned, yet it speaks volumes. Its brevity mirrors the suddenness of stopping itself. It leaves the reader suspended, invited to imagine what preceded the stop and what might follow. Moreover, "and then it stopped" invites us to consider the nature of endings in our own lives. How do we face moments when things stop, when jobs end, friendships fade, and seasons change? Do we resist, mourn, accept, or embrace these stops? The phrase offers no answers but opens a space for contemplation and a narrative context. This line can serve as a powerful turning point. It can mark the end of a chapter, the closing of a door, or the beginning of a new phase. It commands attention through its finality, its suddenness, and its mystery. Finally, the phrase touches on the human relationship with control. Stopping is often outside our power. Things stop unexpectedly, machines break, people leave, and feelings change. This lack of control can be unsettling, yet it also teaches humility and acceptance. In conclusion, "and then it stopped" is a small phrase heavy with meaning. It encapsulates endings, pauses, transformation, and the human experience of sudden stillness. It reminds us that all things move toward cessation, but within that stopping, new possibilities and reflections arise. It is the quiet moment when the world holds its breath. Before the next breath, the final note before silence, and the last page turned before the story's meaning settles.